In October of 1919, the President of the United States vanished. Woodrow Wilson lay paralyzed behind a locked White House door, and for 17 months, every bill, every appointment, and every decision of the executive branch passed through one person. She had never been elected. She had never been confirmed. She was his wife, and she was not the first. For 200 years, the Constitution has never once mentioned the First Lady. No law defines her power. Yet 5 women turned that silence into an empire and ran America from a position that does not officially exist. Chapter 1. The Office That Does Not Exist. There is one position in the American government with no salary, no oath, no definition, and no limit, and the Constitution never saw it coming. The framers spent the summer of 1787 arguing over every word of the presidency. They defined how a president would be chosen, how he could be removed, and what he could and could not do. They never wrote a single sentence about the woman who would live beside him. That silence was not a small oversight. It became the largest unregulated power vacuum in American history. Think about what the role actually offers. The First Lady eats breakfast with the most powerful man on earth. She hears him think out loud when the aides have gone home. She knows which advisors flatter him and which ones lie to him. She controls the last conversation of his day and the first one of his morning. No cabinet secretary has that access. No senator has that trust. And because no law defines her role, no law restrains it. She cannot be confirmed, so she cannot be blocked. She holds no office, so she cannot be impeached. The system has no tool to check her, because the system pretends she is not there. This is the story of 5 women who understood that and used it. Abigail Adams, advising a founding father through more than 1,100 letters, while the law said she could not own so much as a teaspoon. Dolley Madison, who turned a parlor into the only working machinery of compromise in a capital that settled arguments with duels. Edith Wilson, who ran the executive branch for 17 months while the president lay paralyzed behind a locked door. Eleanor Roosevelt, who built her own press corps, her own platform, and eventually her own seat at the United Nations. And Nancy Reagan, the modern endpoint of the pattern, who proved that 2 centuries later, the most feared operator in Washington still held no office at all. 5 women, 5 eras, one job that does not exist. Each of them was attacked with the same accusation, worded for her own century. Mrs. President, Petticoat government, meddler, dragon lady. The insult never changed because the truth behind it never changed. Each of these women was doing the job. The country just was not ready to admit the job was real. It begins on a farm in Massachusetts, with a woman writing letters by candlelight while her husband helped invent the United States. What she wrote would echo for 200 years. Chapter 2. The advisor they called Mrs. President. While John Adams argued for independence in Philadelphia, the sharpest political mind in his life was writing to him from a farm in Massachusetts. Abigail Adams was born in Weymouth in 1744, the daughter of a minister, with no formal schooling at all. She taught herself in her father's library. By the time she married John Adams in 1764, she could argue politics, scripture, and philosophy with any man in the colony. John knew it. He called her his best, dearest, worthiest, wisest friend. He meant it as a compliment. It was also simply an accurate job description. Their marriage became the longest political correspondence in early American history. More than 1,100 letters survive between them. While John sat in Congress and later served as a diplomat in Europe, those letters carried news, analysis, and advice in both directions. She told him what Massachusetts was thinking. She measured the loyalty of his allies and the danger of his rivals. For roughly 10 years of their marriage, an ocean sat between them, and she ran everything he left behind. And here is what makes that extraordinary. Under the law of her era, Abigail Adams barely existed. The doctrine was called coverture, and it meant that a married woman's legal identity dissolved into her husband's. She could not own property. She could not sign a contract. She could not keep her own wages. The law saw one person in that marriage, and it was not her. Yet through the war, she managed the family farm in Braintree, handled tenants, paid wartime taxes, hired labor, and kept the family solvent through inflation that ruined her neighbors. She buried a stillborn daughter in 1777 and went back to the ledgers. Then she went further. John believed in land. Land was safe, solid, respectable. Abigail looked at the depreciated government securities trading at a fraction of their face value and saw what her husband did not. Working through her uncle, Cotton Tufts, she quietly bought government paper with money she set aside and called her own pocket money. It was a maneuver around a legal system that said she could own nothing. When the new federal government later funded those securities at full value, her judgment was vindicated in hard numbers. The investor in the Adams family wore a dress, and she outperformed a future president. By the 1790s, John Adams was vice president and then president, and Abigail's counsel reached into appointments, foreign policy, and the press wars tearing the young republic apart. Her enemies noticed. They always do. And the name they chose for her would become the first entry in a 200-year pattern of accusation. Chapter 3. She asked him to remember the ladies. In March of 1776, Abigail Adams asked the men founding America to limit their own power over women, and her husband laughed. The letter was dated March 31. Congress was moving toward independence, and Abigail saw the opening with perfect clarity. If they were writing a new code of laws, she told John, then remember the ladies. Be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, she wrote, all men would be tyrants if they could. And if women were ignored, she warned, they were determined to foment a rebellion of their own, and would not hold themselves bound by laws in which they had no voice. It is one of the most famous letters in American history. At the time, it accomplished nothing. John wrote back that he could not help laughing, and joked that men knew better than to repeal their masculine systems. The men in Philadelphia kept coverture. They kept it for nearly another century. But the letter survived, and the argument inside it never stopped being true. She had identified the flaw in the founding, while the founding was still wet ink. 2 decades later, she was First Lady, and the council had become operational. When the XYZ affair pushed the country to the edge of war with France in 1798, Abigail sat at the center of the Federalist Information Network, reading the dispatches, weighing the factions, sharpening her husband's resolve. When opposition newspapers savaged the administration, she urged action against the editors, and she supported the Alien and Sedition Acts that made such prosecutions possible. History has judged those laws harshly, and her role in supporting them is part of her record. Power is not a flattering portrait. She wielded it, and she owns the consequences, the same as any man in the cabinet. Her opponents understood exactly where the influence lived. Albert Gallatin, the leader of the Republican opposition in Congress, sneered that she was Mrs. President, not of the United States, but of a faction. Read that attack again, slowly. The opposition leader of the United States Congress believed that to fight the president, he had to name the president's wife. The insult was meant to wound her. Instead, it certified her. You do not attack a woman pouring tea. You attack a woman moving power. In 1801, John lost to Jefferson, and the Adamses went home to Quincy. Abigail died in 1818, 6 years before her son, John Quincy Adams, won the White House she had once run. The advisor era was over. The next woman would not advise the machine from beside it. She would build a machine of her own, out of candlelight, ice cream, and a guest list. Chapter 4. The Hostess Who Disarmed His Enemies. James Madison wrote the Constitution, but he could barely work a room, so his wife built a weapon out of a parlor. Madison was brilliant and tiny, a pale and awkward man who mumbled at dinner and froze in crowds. Dolley was his opposite in every visible way. Born to a Quaker family in North Carolina in 1768, she had survived the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which killed roughly 5,000 people in a single season, among them her first husband and her infant son. She remarried in 1794, introduced to Madison by Aaron Burr. She was 26. He was 43. Washington society never produced a more effective partnership. Understand what the Capitol looked like when the Madisons reached the presidency in 1809. Washington was a muddy village with marble ambitions, and its politics were poisonous. Federalists and Republicans did not merely oppose each other, they despised each other. Men settled political arguments with pistols at dawn. Only 5 years earlier, the sitting vice president had shot Alexander Hamilton dead. There was no neutral ground anywhere in American public life. So Dolley Madison created one. Every Wednesday night, she opened the White House drawing rooms to everyone, both parties, friends and enemies, congressmen, diplomats, editors, and their wives, as many as 200 or 300 people packed so tightly the press called the evenings squeezes. She wore feathered turbans, served ice cream, remembered every name, and moved through the crowd, placing exactly the right rival beside exactly the right ally. It looked like a party. It functioned as a legislature. Her parlor was the one room in America where opponents had to be civil to each other, and deals that could not survive daylight were made over her punch bowl. Do not mistake the warmth for softness. This was strategy, executed weekly for 8 years. While her husband struggled to charm a single guest, Dolley gathered intelligence, softened enemies, and counted votes by candlelight. The Federalists understood what was being done to them. After Madison won the election of 1808, his defeated opponent, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, reportedly admitted that he had been beaten by Mr. and Mrs. Madison, and that he might have stood a better chance against Mr. Madison alone. The quote survives second-hand, but the sentiment was universal in Washington. The presidency was a partnership, and everyone negotiating with it knew which partner controlled the room. By 1812, Dolley Madison was the most famous woman in America, and her Wednesday machine had helped carry her husband to a second term and through the outbreak of war with Britain. Then, in the summer of 1814, the war came up the road toward her front door, and the hostess faced a test no guest list could solve. Chapter 5. The Portrait. She refused to leave behind. On August 24, 1814, with British troops hours from the White House door, the most famous woman in America would not run. The American militia defending Washington had collapsed at Bladensburg. The president was away with the army. The cabinet had scattered. Inside the White House, the dinner table was set for 40 guests who would never arrive, and messengers galloped up every hour, begging the president's wife to flee. Dolley Madison stood in the dining room with a spyglass and waited. She was not waiting for rescue. She was waiting for a painting. Hanging in the state dining room was the full-length Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, the image of the Republic itself. Dolley understood instantly what its capture would mean. The British would parade it through London as a trophy, the founder dragged behind an enemy army. She refused to let the symbol fall. The frame was screwed to the wall, and the screws would not give, so she ordered the frame broken. The canvas was pulled free and handed to two trusted men, and only then, with the portrait rolling away to safety and British torches almost in sight, did she leave. Hours later, the White House burned to a shell. Of everything that filled the original mansion, the portrait she saved is the only object that remains in the White House today. It hangs in the East Room. She is the reason. The legend was instant and permanent. In a war full of humiliations, the steadiest officer in Washington had been a woman in a turban. But history rarely pays its legends. Madison died in 1836, and Dolley's later years became a long lesson in what the era did to women without a man's income. Her surviving son, Payne Todd, gambled and drank his way through the family fortune. She was forced to sell Montpelier itself in 1844. The woman who had run the Capitol lived across the square from the White House in genteel poverty, sometimes short of firewood. So she made her final moves with the only asset left: history itself. She sold her husband's papers to Congress, $30,000 for the first portion in 1837, and $25,000 for the remainder in 1848, with the second sum locked in trust, where her son could not reach it. Even ruined, she calculated, and the Capitol never stopped bowing. In 1844, the House of Representatives granted her an honorary seat on its own floor, an honor invented for her. When she died in 1849, her funeral was the largest Washington had ever seen. She had proven a parlor could govern. The next woman in this story would prove something far more dangerous, that a bedroom could. Chapter 6. The Stroke That Made Her President. On October 2, 1919, Woodrow Wilson collapsed on a bathroom floor, and his wife made a decision no one had elected her to make. To understand what Edith Wilson did next, you have to understand who she was. Born Edith Bowling in Wytheville, Virginia, in 1872, she had come to Washington as the wife of a jeweler, Norman Galt, whose family store was the finest in the capital. When he died in 1908, she did not sell the business. She ran it, through managers, as a widowed businesswoman with her own money in an age that found the idea faintly scandalous. She was reportedly the first woman in Washington to drive her own automobile, an electric car she steered through streets full of staring men. She met the widowed President Wilson in 1915 and married him within the year. And she did not become a decoration. During the First World War, Wilson trusted her with the secret wartime code, and she sat beside him, decoding classified diplomatic messages, reading what only the innermost circle of the government was cleared to read. When he sailed to Paris for the peace conference, she went too. By 1919, there was no person on earth the president trusted more, and almost no paper he saw that she had not seen first. Then came the fight of his life. The Treaty of Versailles, with his League of Nations inside it, faced a hostile Senate, and Wilson took the case to the people directly. A speaking tour of roughly 8,000 miles in 22 days. His body broke before the Senate did. He collapsed in Colorado, was rushed back to Washington, and on the morning of October 2nd, his wife found him unconscious on the bathroom floor. The stroke paralyzed his left side. The President of the United States could not sit up in bed. The Constitution, in 1919, had no answer for this. No procedure existed for presidential disability. The Vice President, Thomas Marshall, was a man nobody, including Edith, considered remotely adequate. The doctors told her the presidency itself might be the only thing keeping Wilson's will to live intact. So Edith Wilson chose. There would be no resignation. There would be no public truth. With the White House physician, Dr. Carey Grayson, she sealed the sick room and announced that the president was suffering from exhaustion. Then she established the rule that made her, in practice, the head of the executive branch of the United States. Nothing, and no one, would reach Woodrow Wilson except through her. Not a bill, not a senator, not a cabinet secretary, not a single sheet of paper. She called it her stewardship. The country, when it finally found out, would call it something else. Chapter 7. 17 Months of Petticoat Government. For 17 months, senators, secretaries, and foreign governments addressed the United States government and got answers in a woman's handwriting. This is how the stewardship worked. Every document intended for the president went to Edith Wilson. She read it. She decided whether her husband would ever see it. If she judged it worthy, she summarized it in her own words at his bedside. And what came back out of that room were instructions written in her hand in the margins of state papers. The president says. The president wishes. Cabinet secretaries ran departments for months on notes like these, never knowing how much of each sentence was Woodrow Wilson and how much was his wife. Count what passed through that filter. 17 months of an American presidency. 28 bills that became law without the president's signature, because the constitutional clock simply ran out while paperwork waited outside a sick room. A cabinet kept in the dark. A vice president kept at a distance. And the greatest foreign policy question of the age, the Treaty of Versailles, decided while the man who negotiated it could not hold a pen steadily. Edith begged him to compromise with Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and accept the Senate's reservations. The broken man refused, all or nothing. The treaty failed in November 1919, and failed again on March 1920, 7 votes short. The League of Nations went forward without the United States inside it. Washington was not entirely fooled. Secretary of State Robert Lansing began quietly convening the cabinet on his own authority, and for that act of initiative, he was forced out in February 1920. The Senate sent Albert Fall of New Mexico, one of Wilson's bitterest enemies, to test whether a president still existed. "We have a petticoat government," Fall had thundered. "Mrs. Wilson is president." Edith staged the visit like a theatre director. Wilson propped up, his paralyzed side covered, his answers rehearsed. Fall left bested, and the Regency rolled on. And here is the irony history almost never says out loud. In August 1920, in the middle of this exact period, the 19th Amendment was ratified. American women won the right to vote for president at the precise moment a woman who had never received a vote was, in practical fact, running the presidency. Edith Wilson held more executive power than any American woman before her, months before most women in America had ever legally touched a ballot. Her stewardship ended with Wilson's term in March 1921. She guarded him until his death in 1924, and guarded his legend for 37 years after that, insisting in her memoir that she had never made a single decision regarding public affairs. Historians have weighed that claim against the record. The record wins. The next woman in this story drew the opposite lesson from power. She decided to wield it in broad daylight. Chapter 8. The First Lady Who Held Press Conferences. 2 days after her husband took office, Eleanor Roosevelt did something no First Lady had ever done. She summoned the press herself. It was March 1933, the bottom of the Great Depression, and the new First Lady invited reporters into the Red Room for her own press conference, separate from the president's. Then came the rule that revealed the strategist underneath. Men were banned. Only female reporters could attend. With one stroke, Every news organization in America faced a choice: hire women or go blind to the First Lady of the United States. They hired women. She held 348 of those press conferences over 12 years, and an entire generation of female journalists owed their careers to a guest list. That was Eleanor Roosevelt's signature. Where Edith Wilson had hidden power behind a locked door, Eleanor built power in public, piece by piece, and dared anyone to object. Starting on the last day of December 1935, she wrote a newspaper column called My Day, 6 days a week, syndicated across the country to an audience that reached an estimated 4 million readers. No First Lady had ever possessed her own national media platform. She used it for 27 years. She earned her own money, too, from columns, lectures, and radio broadcasts, in some years as much as $75,000, rivaling the president's own salary, and she gave most of it away. She needed the independence because the marriage behind the partnership had already broken once. In 1918, she had discovered Franklin's affair with her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The marriage survived as something colder and stronger, a political alliance between two professionals. And when polio took Franklin's legs in 1921, the alliance found its shape. He had the office. She had the mobility. She became, in his own description, his eyes and ears, and in practice his legs, traveling the country to inspect coal mines, relief programs, and prisons, then reporting back to the most powerful desk on earth. Washington had never seen anything like her, and much of Washington hated it. She was mocked in the press, caricatured without mercy, and watched by the FBI, which built one of the largest files in its history on the First Lady of the United States. Her crime, in the eyes of her enemies, was motion. She lobbied for the National Youth Administration. She championed the unemployed. And she pushed hardest, exactly where the administration least wanted pressure. Franklin's New Deal depended on the votes of Southern segregationists, so the White House wanted the subject of race kept quietly buried. Eleanor refused to bury it. And in 1939, an organization of proud American ladies handed her the chance to show the whole country exactly what a First Lady's power could do. Chapter 9. She forced the doors open, anyway. When the daughters of the American Revolution barred a black singer from their hall, the First Lady of the United States resigned in public. The singer was Marian Anderson, one of the great contraltos of the century, and in early 1939, the DAR refused to let her perform at Constitution Hall in Washington because she was black. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member. On February 26, she resigned, and she did it in her column, in front of 4 million readers, writing that the organization had set an example she could not follow. Then she went further. Working with the administration, she helped arrange something better than a concert hall. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1939, Marian Anderson sang from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before a crowd of 75,000 people and a radio audience in the millions. The image of a black artist singing of her country at Lincoln's feet became one of the founding pictures of the civil rights movement. A First Lady's resignation letter had built that stage. She kept pushing. In March 1941, she flew over Tuskegee, Alabama, in a small plane piloted by Charles Anderson, the black chief flight instructor, while her Secret Service detail objected. The photograph said what the White House could not say on the record: "The First Lady backs black military aviation." The men of Tuskegee went on to fly with distinction through the war. During that war, she worked herself to the edge of collapse. In 1943, she made a Pacific tour of 5 weeks and roughly 25,000 miles, walking hospital wards, island after island, and by the military's own estimates, she visited about 400,000 servicemen. Admirals who had dreaded the visit wrote afterward that she did more good than any other civilian who passed through. Then, in April 1945, Franklin died, and with him, the office her power had been built beside. She told reporters the story was over. She was wrong by 17 years. In December 1945, President Truman appointed her a delegate to the brand new United Nations, where the diplomats expected a ceremonial widow and met a parliamentary fighter instead. She was elected to chair the Commission on Human Rights, and she drove the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through committee sessions that ran past midnight, bridging American, Soviet, Chinese, and Lebanese delegates by sheer stamina. On December 10, 1948, the General Assembly adopted the declaration by a vote of 48-0, with 8 abstentions, and then the delegates of the world stood and gave her an ovation. Truman called her the First Lady of the World. The unelected role had just rewritten the rights of the human race. There was one more era to come, and it would prove the pattern had never weakened. It had only changed clothes. Chapter 10. The Gatekeeper of the Reagan White House. By 1987, the pattern was 2 centuries old, and the most feared political operator in Washington had never held a single office. Her name was Nancy Reagan, and this channel has told her full story before. Here she matters as the proof, the modern endpoint of everything Abigail, Dolley, Edith, and Eleanor began. 200 years after the founders forgot to define the role was still running the building. Nancy Reagan's power was personnel. She did not write policy memos. She decided who got to write them. Her husband was genial, trusting, and famously allergic to confrontation, the kind of man who could not bring himself to fire anyone. That created a vacuum at the center of the most powerful office on earth, and his wife filled it. She watched the staff the way Dolley Madison had once watched a drawing room, measuring who served her husband and who served themselves. The Capitol learned the rule quickly. Ronald Reagan forgave almost everyone. Nancy Reagan forgave almost no one. The record runs back before the White House. In February 1980, with the campaign floundering, she was instrumental in the firing of campaign manager John Sears on the very day of the New Hampshire primary, a move that cleared the way for the team that won the presidency. Inside the administration, senior officials learned that her opposition could end a career and her protection could save one. But her defining move came when the presidency itself was in danger. In November 1986, the Iran and Contra scandal broke. Secret arms sales to Iran, money diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua, and a White House in free fall. Reagan's approval rating dropped roughly 20 points almost overnight, the worst collapse of his presidency. The man at the center of the storm, in Nancy's cold judgment, was White House Chief of Staff Donald Regan, the former Merrill Lynch chairman who ran the West Wing like a corporation and treated the First Lady like an inconvenience. He had hung up the phone on her. It is hard to find a worse decision in the history of American staff work. What followed was a months-long campaign of removal, waged through allies like the strategist Stuart Spencer, through carefully placed arguments, and through direct, relentless pressure on her husband. The president resisted. He hated firing people. She did not relent. On February 27, 1987, Donald Regan resigned, and a steadier hand, former Senator Howard Baker, took his place within hours. The Chief of Staff of the United States, the man who controlled the president's door, had been removed by the woman who controlled the president's trust. And the strangest part of her story was still waiting to come out. It involved a stopwatch, a San Francisco astrologer, and the schedule of the most powerful man in the world. Chapter 11. The Astrologer and the Apology. After the bullet nearly killed her husband, Nancy Reagan began checking the presidential schedule against the stars, and the schedule obeyed. On March 30, 1981, just 69 days into the presidency, John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan outside the Washington Hilton. The bullet stopped an inch from his heart. Nancy never recovered from that afternoon. Fear became her permanent residence, and fear went looking for a tool. She found Joan Quigley, a San Francisco astrologer, and for years afterward, the timing of presidential travel, announcements, and major events was quietly checked against Quigley's charts, paid for privately, hidden even from most of the senior staff. The country learned about it only in 1988, when the fired Donald Regan took his revenge in a memoir, revealing that the schedule of the leader of the free world had been shaped by astrology. Washington laughed at her. But notice what the scandal actually proved. Even her critics had to concede the premise. Whatever touched the president's calendar touched the presidency, and she controlled the calendar. Her instincts, mocked at the time, kept being vindicated. During Iran and Contra, the lawyers and loyalists told the president to admit nothing. Nancy told him the opposite. Take responsibility, apologize, and the country will forgive you. On March 4, 1987, days after Reagan's removal, Ronald Reagan delivered the address in which he accepted full responsibility for the affair, and his approval began to climb back. She pushed on the world stage, too. Against the hardliners in his own administration who distrusted any thaw, she consistently favored engagement with Mikhail Gorbachev, encouraging the summitry that helped wind down the Cold War. Hers was one voice among several, but it was the voice with breakfast access, and the policy she favored is the one history got. Then came the longest assignment of her life. In November 1994, the Reagans released a handwritten letter announcing the president's Alzheimer's diagnosis, a disclosure that changed how America talked about the disease. For the next decade, Nancy was his caregiver and the custodian of his legacy, controlling the image, the library, the memory. In her final political act, she broke with her own party's orthodoxy to publicly champion federal funding for embryonic stem cell research, lobbying senators in the disease's name. She died in March 2016 and was buried beside him. Set her beside the others, and the pattern closes like a circuit. Abigail with her letters, Dolley with her guest lists, Edith with her locked door, Eleanor with her press corps, Nancy with her personnel files. 5 different centuries of tools, one identical truth underneath. Which leaves the final question this story has been building toward for 200 years. What does it mean that none of it was ever official? Chapter 12. 200 years of unelected power. The Constitution still does not mention her, and after 200 years, that silence remains the most revealing sentence never written in American law. The system did eventually respond to these women in its own way. After Edith Wilson's hidden regency, it took the country another 5 decades, but in 1967, the 25th Amendment finally wrote rules for presidential disability, a constitutional patch applied directly over the hole she had governed through. The East Wing grew a professional staff, a press office, a budget, an institution built to contain a role the founders never imagined. Containment mostly failed. Access cannot be legislated. Trust cannot be confirmed by the Senate. The power these 5 women found will exist as long as presidents are human beings who talk to someone at the end of the day. Look at what that unofficial power actually produced. A founding correspondence of 1,100 letters that still teaches us what the revolution meant. The only object from the original White House still hanging in the White House. 17 months of an American presidency conducted in a woman's handwriting. 348 press conferences, a concert before 75,000 people, and a Declaration of Human Rights adopted 48-0 for the entire human race. A chief of staff removed, a Cold War softened, a nation taught to say the word Alzheimer's out loud. None of it elected, none of it confirmed, all of it real, and every one of them paid the same tax for it. The accusation never changed, only the costume. Mrs. President, they sneered at Abigail. Petticoat government, they thundered at Edith. Meddler, they sighed at Eleanor. Dragon lady, they whispered about Nancy. 5 eras of American men reached for an insult and grabbed the same one every time, because every time the charge underneath was identical. She is doing the job. The insult was never really a denial of their power. It was the receipt for it. So remember what they actually did. They did not ask for permission. They did not wait for an invitation. They were handed a role with no duties, no budget, no authority, and no existence in law. And they walked it into the room where the decisions were made. And they sat down. Every woman who has since stood for office in her own name. Every woman confirmed by a Senate that once could not touch her predecessors. Every woman who reads a briefing book instead of smuggling one past a locked door. Each of them inherits ground that was first held by women who governed without a title, because a title was the one thing America refused to give them. The Constitution never mentioned the First Lady. For 200 years, that was supposed to mean she did not matter. These 5 women quietly proved it meant the opposite. The most powerful women in America were standing in the one place the law never thought to look. And now that you know who was actually in the room, the official history of the United States reads differently.